Maybe I'll give a tip from an interviewer perspective, right? I see a lot of people when we ask behavioral questions, they answer for 5 minutes. But the problem with that is,
Generally, behavioral interviews are pretty common, irrespective of the role. Sometimes, right? Like they are hiring, so the principles remains the same.
hello everybody, welcome to our podcast, Everything Product. So we talk about the latest technology with a product mindset. I'm Sid Saladi. I work as a product manager for Best Buy.
I'm Srinath. I'm a product manager at JP Morgan.
Okay, last video was a big hit for us, right? Like it was a highly watched video. That was how to edit a resume and how to modify a resume for a product management interview. We'll continue that, and we'll help more product managers trying to break into product management here. I think behavioral interviews are a core piece of any product manager's interview, and many people want to know how to answer them or how to approach a behavioral interview. And it's also that different companies do behavioral in different ways, and each have different goals. So let's maybe get into the topic, right? Because even we have interviewed a lot of product managers, and we know what we are looking for in a product manager, right? So let's maybe put that lens on and explain our viewers on how a product managers or aspiring product managers should approach a behavioral question. I'll get to Srinath. So Srinath has worked for Amazon before, and Amazon is famously known for its behavioral questions and its 14 leadership principles. So what's your take on it, Srinath?
Essentially, they are basically trying to test a person's soft communication skills and how if the person can be a good fit for the company and the team's culture. They're looking at a lot of those aspects. So Amazon, as many of you know, is pretty popular for its 14 leadership principles, which they usually test in any interview, especially no matter what, if it's a product management interview or even an SD interview. I mean, they test that principles. Number of leadership principles they may test may quite vary. But for product managers, it's very important. I would say approximately 40 to 50% of every round is behavioral interview. So
Yeah.
that's why one needs to be really good at leadership principles if you're entering in Amazon.
Okay. So, yeah, what would be some tips which you would follow while preparing for behavioral interviews, right? Like everybody, you must have gone through a lot of these cycles, right? And maybe acquired some nuggets where you can share with people on how they can be better at answering some of these questions. Maybe I'll start with you, Srinath.
Yeah. Few things that people can look at is first go through the company website and look around if they have any values, the core values, of all that company, and try to figure out what those are, and make sure you come up with examples for each of that core value from your work experience in a structured format. And I'll talk about structure format in detail later. But if they can have their own examples from their own experiences, at least two for each principle, and have it handy, that will be really helpful during the interviews. The other thing which I also look at is what, not just the leadership principles, what company cares about in general. Maybe like a few companies care about more about energy, a few companies may care about customers and all that stuff. So you'll see that different nuances within the website, so that as well. And the third thing which I will say is job description. Job description a lot of times also highlights some of the key skills that they are looking for in a person. So make sure you understand what those are, and when you are responding, make sure you use the relevant keywords. A lot of time, I mean, you may see that, oh, you need to collaborate with these many stakeholders in building something. So when you look at that, you'll think that, oh, okay, I need to have examples around where I collaborated with people when I build something. So something like that. So these are the general tips I would say. So every company has their own principles, so make sure you go through them and be ready before the interview.
Yeah, I think it's always good to customize whatever you're preparing for that specific company, right? Like it's always targeted to that role or that job description which you're trying to crack for that moment.
Generally, behavioral interviews are pretty common irrespective of the role. Sometimes, right, like they are hiring, So the principles remains the same.
I feel that like when you are when you have done this process so many times and you pick a topic which is you're very familiar with, the flow just goes on even though we don't prepare for it, right? But yeah, so I think from my side, what I feel is right. Maybe I'll give a tip from an interviewer perspective, right? I see a lot of people when we ask behavioral questions, they answer for 5 minutes, but the problem with that is after the first minute or so, I'm lost, right? Because there are too many distractions for a lot of people, and it's tough to keep your concentration for so long, right? So I think that's why make sure anybody who's doing a behavioral interview, right? Make sure you bucket or anchor the things which you're talking about. You could talk about the framework which you say, or at least you say that I'll talk about the this is what I tried, this is what the results are, these are the different strategies or something like that, and make sure you keep it to 1 or 2 minutes on each of the topics which you're talking about, and check with the interview if he's good, does he wants to dig deep into any of these things, so that that keeps the conversation engaged and both the parties are involved in what you're talking about, right? So I think that is very very important. One example was like one of the behavioral question a person answered for 12 minutes or 13 minutes. I was like done. I only grabbed the first 2 minutes of the information. After that, it's very difficult to process and even understand the flow of thoughts or the rambling the person is doing.
I'd like to add one more common mistake that generally people make is right away jump into the answer without thinking through the question that the person asked. I experienced some of those, like where when I ask a question, they directly jump and then figure out or ramble and all that stuff. So it's always good to take that 1 or 2 minutes to put their thoughts together on paper and speak out in the within next 2 minutes about the response.
Have you observed this where people jump in right immediately, they make a mistake, and later they try supporting it, then they figure out that they have made a mess out of the question, right? It even happened to me, right? Like it's a general behavior where as humans we tend to jump to conclusions very fast, but I think the practice makes us more perfect where we want to give a processed answer rather than just random thoughts out of our mind. Even though you are very stressed or there are a lot of things going on, when you have like first 1 or 2 very good conversations with that person, you get that curiosity and you start digging deep, and you'll have a really good, there's a state change, right, where you are in the interview. And also I think when you have that kind of conversations, that will leave an impact on the interviewer and he'll rate you better when the deciding factor comes in. Yeah, so I think those are like really, really great tips. Let's also talk about some formats, right? So there are a lot of different formats out, but let's talk about like what your experience is and what the formats you would follow doing behavioral interviews. So, Srinath, I know that STAR is a very standard format everybody follows. Uh, are there any other formats you follow? If not, if you also follow STAR, how would you apply that to the leadership principles at Amazon?
So most of the time I use star. So I feel like that's the best way to respond. I feel like in a more structured way. So the way I use that is, for instance, let's take Amazon, right? So Amazon has, as we discussed, has 14 leadership principles. So let's take one of the leadership principles, that is customer obsession, which is basically solving problems backwards from the customer. Understand the customer problems and building solutions. So that's what that leadership principle is about. So I take that leadership principle and try to create a story around that where I delivered a customer promise or a customer value, where I solved a complex pain point for a customer, something like that. I pick up that and write in a structured format, which is a star. S stands for situation, T stands for task, A stands for action, and R for result. So I try to create a story. What was the situation? When did that happen? The task is all about what was my goal. Action was about what all I did to achieve that goal, and result was what was the final outcome. And one tip which I would like to give everyone is make sure you quantify the result. Otherwise, people wouldn't know the impact that you created for customers. So this is how I would approach and take that star and apply to any leadership principle for whichever the company that you're applying. So Amazon has 14, so you can navigate the other leadership principles and apply the same concept.
Yeah. So I think that's a very important point, right? So it's not about the outcome, output, but the outcome. So, the result is not that you have released 5 features. It's about the 5 features released increased adoption by this percentage or increased revenue by so and so percentage. That's what we want to show. If you don't have
Exactly.
quantifiable results, as an interviewer, I don't understand what impact you have created, right? It's just a simple story which is not giving me perspective of what impact you have had on that product or the organization which you work for. So unless and you quantify it, I don't understand it.
Exactly. One thing which I want to end there is, if we don't summarize the impact, then they may think that, oh, it's his job. He
Yep.
just did his job. He didn't go above and beyond to solve a customer pain point, which is what will really come from that impact.
Yeah, and one other follow up would be that you basically use the same star format for all the leadership principles, but the outcome or the inference of what you're talking about would be basically showing how you executed or displayed that leadership principle or value, right?
Yes, and one more thing which I also want to like to add here is, make sure, even when you respond, when you will keep your answer for like less than 2 minutes, right? When you write as well, don't make it too complex. Don't write too many 10 actions, right? It's not realistic to respond, and also don't write too many metrics as well, because that it may be hard for an interviewer who is probably not aware of the problem. I
Hmm.
mean, he may easily get distracted into the numbers. What they care about is, okay, take one metric, did he improve from X to Y? That's it. That's what they care about. Not
Yeah.
about like 10 metrics, you improved this by X, this by Y, this by Z, and all. I think for Amazon, at least, I mean, when I worked, we live and breathe on leadership principles. So, for instance, if we are writing a product requirements doc, right, we always work backward from the customer problem. When you think through, when you are customer obsessed, so you think that way rather than you just go and build and you what you think is right, rather than working backward for customer. You use that in almost every day in every meeting, some or the other way. And another example which I can give you is, I mean, in a meeting, not everyone may agree with your approach, right? Obviously, there will be people who may not be bought into that idea. That's okay. You can take calculated risks and obviously learn from the mistakes if it doesn't work. So I've seen people using something called like have backbone, disagree, and commit. That's one of the popular leadership principle that you will also see in Amazon. So the, some of the people use that like saying, "Oh, I'll disagree and commit to mine. So this is my opinion. This is what I do." But that's okay. Not everyone in the room has to agree with the solution. There'll be one or two who won't be agreed, but that's okay. So you live and breathe on all these leadership principles.
Correct me if I'm wrong, Srinath, but the backstory for this leadership principles is, I think Jeff Bezos was like trying to research all the different companies, what are making them successful and all of that stuff. And then he put together all of these life sense lessons together. And the leadership principles were one of the letters which he sent out in shareholders meeting or something like that, right? From there onwards, it was more exercised and, followed. And that became like the culture inside the companies. Is that true?
Yeah, I think to some extent, yes. And I heard they spent a significant amount of time in drafting these and finalizing.
Okay.
So I think it took like months of effort. But one thing, to be honest, I worked in many companies, but I've not seen any company practicing leadership principles
That's right.
as
Yeah.
good as Amazon.
Yeah,
That I can.
a company's culture is very important, right? So some companies say that this is our culture, but they do not follow. But I think the culture brings everything together, and the way you work, the way you communicate, the way you showcase what you're trying to do, and all of that. Yeah. So at least the way which I look at behavioral, right? So couple of things which I do is, for me, it is very difficult to remember so many scenarios. So I try to make it simple. So what I do is I uh, come up with 3 success stories, 3 failure stories, one why product manager, one why that company, and these are the 8 things which I follow. And for all of these stories, I try to fit it into any of the behavioral questions which they ask. The stories are bigger stories, they have multiple different things and all of that stuff, but most of my answers would cover these scenarios which I practiced for. And for me, other thing which I follow is, right, mocks make it easier for me to answer questions, so I do as many mocks as possible. So I think that gets me in the flow and makes me more comfortable and familiar with the situation I'm talking about, and also the environment which I am in the interview. So that's what I would follow. Okay,
Nice.
let's move on. So maybe let's talk about some examples of a behavioral question, right? So people might be wondering, yeah, you have talked about the formats, and they're like, what is, like? Can you give me an example of a behavioral question?
I can take a stab at it. So you can say, tell me about a time where you uh, launched an innovative solution, right? So basically, the interviewer in that case is asking you, okay, how do you solve complex problems and build solutions, right? So you can also tie it to one of the Amazon leadership principles, which is called invent and simplify, which is all talking about uh, how do you go and innovate on behalf of customers, right? So that is the, I mean, basically the question.
So, Srinath, I have a question. So inherently, when you get questions in Amazon, right? So it is either tied to some of the leadership principle or not. So you have to figure out what leadership principle is it tied to, and maybe answer based on that. Is that how you go about?
Yes, you're right. So typically, a product manager interview has 5 rounds, and every round usually they pick one or two leadership principles which are more relevant for the job, and they test questions taking that leadership principles without directly saying, "Oh, let's talk about customer obsession," and next asking that question. They don't say, "Oh, it's about customer obsession." You need to figure out from the question what that's about.
Okay.
So yeah, that's pretty important. And also sometimes you don't need to prepare everything. For instance, yeah, you can be smart, like for instance, if you're applying for an individual contributor role but not a managerial role, you don't need to prepare for hire and develop the best, which is more for managers, right? So that way you can reduce your scope of preparation and focus on the ones which matter.
So also, right, like the behavioral interviews are different based on the company, right, and the role and so on and so forth. So should we like quickly touch base on like how each company does it? Maybe if people want, we can also do a deep dive into each of these companies. But let's start with Amazon, right? Like Srinath is very familiar with that and has worked for Amazon. So what is the format, Srinath? Like how many behavioral rounds does Amazon have, and what are the formats? How long are they are, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, for I mean, for a product manager, generally there are 5 rounds, and behavioral round is some aspect of behavioral interview is embedded in almost every round. I mean,
Okay.
in addition to the product execution, product strategy, and all that stuff, which are general for any common product manager interviews, but this is pretty common in every round.
Okay.
So I'll say for Amazon, yes, it's pretty common.
Okay. Yeah.
So one needs to have examples prepared almost every round. So
Everything.
the best tip which I would again give is take that 14 leadership principles, write two examples, and keep it ready in your mind, and just go and basically talk about it during each of the interviews.
Yeah, and also I see that Amazon is little different compared to Google or Meta, right? So normal Google or Meta has execution, strategy, and design, but Amazon is just relying on more of behavioral and trying to understand what the experience is and so on and so forth. Yeah, so maybe I'll also give an example of how Meta works, right? Meta normally has two different rounds. The first is screening rounds, which has product design and product execution. Product design is more on they give you basically a problem where you come up with solutions at the end. And product execution is you have a problem, you have a product which you define the success metrics for them. uh, and then once you clear that, you go into a loop. The full loop is more on product design again, product execution, and then you have a leadership and drive. So the leadership and drive is Meta's version of behavioral interview, where they basically try to judge you. How can you motivate your team, drive alignment, build relationship, and so on and so forth, right? All of these, they try to test all of that. And the way to prepare for that is have some failure scenarios, success scenarios, and also like why product manager, why the certain role, or why a certain industry, and so on, and all of these. And one specific thing about Meta is Meta focuses a lot on failures. Like, what is the failure story which you can talk about, and how did you learn from them, and what did you implement from that. And one other thing is, like, it's very difficult for people to come up with what are your top three weaknesses, and or what have you ever failed in a project, and how what did you do to make it successful, or have you ever failed in launching a product, right? All of these things are very hard to come up with, so you have to have a very deep introspection of yourself, trying to identify what your failures are. Anybody could talk about success stories, but failure stories are difficult to come. So that's how the format for Meta would be. So great discussion. We covered a lot of topics and also we talked about specific companies and their formats. So if anybody is interested in us digging deep into any of these companies and what, how they do behavioral interviews, please comment, like, share, and subscribe. Also, if anybody wants us to do more mocks, right? We have done a mock series altogether where we were interviewing each other, and that was a very hit series. A lot of people learned a lot from them. If you want us to do another series of product manager mock interviews, we can also do that. Please comment more on that. But thanks for now. Thanks everybody.
Thanks, everyone.